and in Philadelphia and Gettysburg. And he's been on the JBL board for several years now. And he's a member of the Western Conversation, which has been working on producing a guide. So he seemed to be the logical person to lead a discussion of something. It's very common parlance in Roman Catholic circles that this is not a program, it's a process. And it's only going to be a process if it becomes personal. And the only way, if you're the part of the team for directing this process, is if you talk to them one-on-one. And so the crucial beginning point is not when they sign up a sheet or send you an email. The crucial beginning point is precisely when you and they sit down and have an initial conversation. So, Kyle?
Thank you, Michael. Yes, so I'm Kyle. My students call me Dr. KSG. You may be wondering already, why am I in the Western Conversation if I'm in Pennsylvania? That doesn't seem very far west. And it's because when I first started on the JBL board and was part of this conversation, I was teaching in Berkeley, California, where I did my PhD in liturgy and theology. So, so that's how I stayed with that conversation. And as Michael said, one of the things, besides kind of helping congregations and practitioners figure out how to implement this thing or ministry called the catechumenate, but is how to get to some of those things where we don't quite have the right resources or don't have simple resources. And one of those was in what we might call sorting fish. You know, how do you know, or how can you discern how people would best participate and be formed through the catechumenate? I didn't do my introduction, but I'll do it now. I had served in what was kind of a catechumenate director role, although we didn't call it that, at St. Mark's Lutheran in San Francisco for, I was doing stuff for about a decade, and there was a couple of years where I was in charge of everything. And I would say that that was probably one of the most challenging but rewarding aspects of what we did. We did the weekly gatherings, dwelling in the Word. We did the public rites as had been proposed in the Lutheran resources in the late 90s. We did catechesis, but it was that beginning thing to figure out where are they already on their faith journey and what would make the most sense for them as they continue on that journey. And so this came to be a conversation that the Western seminaries group undertook. The Eastern group did stuff with the liturgical rites, which you can go ahead and on our YouTube channel, you can take a look at that. And I think Michael and Jerry will do some more advertising for that and on our website. But the liturgical rites in some sense are, at least as a liturgical scholar, are easy. We have a huge history of liturgical practices on which to draw. But the more kind of formational and, you know, for lack of a better term, organizational aspects of the catechumenate, we have less of historical background on. So that's what we endeavored. As a good professor who has had to teach online for now a number of years, and even before the pandemic, taught a lot online, I'm going to use a PowerPoint just because I know you all love looking at me and books behind me in my office in Gettysburg, which is where I physically am at the moment. The PowerPoint has some very, I think, key terms and phrases for you to glean as we have this conversation. I also have a very particular way of doing PowerPoint, so no big wordy slides. I taught pedagogy for a number of years on how to not kill people with your PowerPoints. So this is really in that first stage of what we're doing, is the idea of welcoming the inquirer. But before we even talk about the nitty-gritty aspects of that, Michael had kind of already alluded to this a little bit, and Larry as well. And this, I believe, was in the handout you were seeing, is really before you even figure out what to do with these people in the catechumenate, it requires us really to understand these ways of engagement that happen through the catechumenate. And I mean, you're all in some sense have various levels of involvement. Some of this will seem repetition, but it's always good to have repetition and hear it again. A lot of what we do, especially for those not going for baptism, but going for membership or reaffirmation or renewal, depending on the language used. I think reaffirmation is what the prayer book uses. We tend to focus a lot on the information. Someone shows up on your doorstep. You know, first you applaud because someone actually showed up at your church. And then you try to figure out what to do. Well, let's tell them a whole bunch of things about who we are. And at least in my Lutheran context, it's often, okay, you go to the pastor class for a couple of times, you figure out where the bathroom is, you get your offering envelope, and now you're meant to be a good member, and someone's going to convince you to serve on a coffee hour committee. Now, that was very common 10 years ago. I think the catechumenate has certainly had an impact on Lutheranism, but still to that place. But a lot of that information, the adult Sunday school or adult catechesis, that kind of model, that is an aspect certainly of the catechumenate. There is this training aspect, but it's more than that. And so we use these four formational words in our Journey to Baptismal Living literature: information, formation, reformation, transformation. And I'll tell you, that took us a long time to make them all get the right prefix for the formation word and how we liked it. The first, like I already alluded to, is information. We do this often quite well. And if we want to really delve into what do we mean by that, that's belief about the God revealed in scriptures. This is about. I believe about these things. I've learned about these things. I know something about this fella named Jesus who appears in the Gospels. I know something about the way the congregation worships. It's a very cognitive-based part of what we do in the catechumenate. But it's really only one aspect. The second is the formation aspect. And it's no longer just belief about, but it's belief in. Belief in the God revealed in Jesus in the scriptures. So this gets us to where we can start to, when we say the creed, we're not just saying a historical literary document from the 3rd and 4th century that shows up in the prayer book. We now can actually say those words as part of who we are as the body of Christ. That's where the belief about changes to the belief in. But this process is not a one and done. I mean, I think for so many years, until maybe the 70s, when both Episcopalians and Lutherans and other mainline Protestants, taking a cue from the decade earlier with the Second Vatican Council, really had a resurgence in baptismal theology, where baptism, dunking the baby, or getting it done, was no longer the end. In some sense, it was the beginning of a lifelong, and here I'll use some Lutheran language, a lifelong death and resurrection that Luther talks about in the Small Catechism that he's pulling from, of course, Romans 6. This reformation or reformation, that this constant ongoing process, living this belief, the belief about and the belief in a daily basis. Of course, the result of all this is a change, a transformation. Theologically, we might say that the full transformation will not come until death and the parousia, where we will all be changed, as Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 15. But we still can see this sense of transformation as a people who live in the reign of God today, not just some fanciful future reality, but in our reality today. Today is, you all good Episcopalians, or most of you know, today's Holy Cross Day, September 14th. What is the Holy Cross about? It's not just because Helena found the cross, supposedly, and built a church, but that the cross has deep impact on people even today, all these years later. And that's this transformational aspect about the catechumenate. And so what happens involves all four of these. And the reason it's important to raise these up now, as we're figuring about, quote unquote, sorting the fish, is because if you were to plot this on a quadrant or put it in a graph of some sort, people are going to be everywhere in all four of these. They may already have a lot of information, but have just begun the formation. They may be very steeped in the formation, but they thought it was one and done, and they need this constant renewal. You may encounter people who have very little information. They watch the History Channel's documentaries on the life of Jesus every year that seem to show up during Easter week, during Holy Week or Easter. Not to be confused with the Ancient Aliens episodes that try to show Jesus was abducted by extraterrestrials, which is the true meaning of the Transfiguration, of course, according to them. But everyone's in various places in this. So it's important in kind of not just as a guiding principle for your work in the catechumenate that you have all four of these actions in mind, but it can also help serve in an to use academic language, as an assessment tool to help people figure out where they are. And that helps you as the practitioner to figure out how best to minister to them as they're going along this journey in whatever they're looking for. And of course, they could be looking for.
If I could add a comment to that, if you're trying to form yourself or a team, even if that's 2 people or 3 people, sharing this kind of discussion among yourselves, you'll discover who's got the information, who's nervous about the information, who's strong on formation and seems to have that gift of drawing people into personal contact with Jesus. And you could use this in building a team, which would be a good thing to do before you then met the people who come to seek.
I think it's exactly right, Michael. I mean that. I'm glad you articulated that directly, because I'm thinking back to the own team building work I did a decade ago at my congregation in San Francisco. And one of the hesitancies we would get for people to join we called it Journeys in Faith, to join the Journeys in Faith team, is because they didn't feel they were strong enough on the information aspect, because they thought they needed, they had to know Luther's Small Catechism inside out, or have the theology degree or something like that. And so For some people, there was hesitancy because they thought they all had to be, old school catechists who knew the stuff backwards and forwards. But like Michael was saying, if you have a team that draws upon multiple gifts, only one or two need to have the information. Much more important in some sense is the formation aspect, because people can read, people can figure, they'll listen to the sermon, they'll attend the adult education session at the parish, but what does this actually mean about them and their own personal beliefs? And then in the Reformation aspect, about how to live that. That's not as direct as the information. So yes, as you form your team, you might want to think about these four approaches or four actions, just like you would when thinking about we'll say program every once in a while, it's not a program, the ministry, the catechumenate ministry that you're doing, and as well as those who are coming to you. Team building, we will cover in another community chat. I don't know when, because we haven't scheduled it yet, but I'm just going to say that right now. So if you want to know more about team building, we'll cover that in a future chat.
I'm just going to second your Reformation thing. I still remember about 8 years ago when in the middle of the process, one of the participants changed jobs because, as he succinctly put it, I didn't like the person I had to become to be part of that company's operations. He had the information, he had the formation. For him, it really was reforming his life.
And we certainly see examples of that in some of the early mystagogical and catechetical sermons in the 4th and 5th century, about speaking of that conversion of life that takes place during their catechumenate, because something real actually happens. Are there any questions or thoughts on these 4 holistic actions of the catechumenate?
Kyle, this is very helpful. How does your model that has been created relate to the traditional stages of the catechumenate?
We'll get to that.
Okay.
Because yes, they certainly do. You're already seeing, and many of you mentioned the 4 stages of the catechumenate. So yeah, you're right that there is certainly a relationship, and we'll get to that in a moment. Other questions or thoughts? So who shows up on your doorstep? Well, lots of people, hopefully, but when looking at the catechumenate in its sense of those not necessarily preparing for baptism, which of course happens more often. I would say in my years, maybe 75 to 80% of those who came through our catechumenate ministry were going for affirmation of baptism or membership or something. Only 20-25% were adult baptismal candidates. So why might they show up on your doorstep? And really, I mean, there's a number of reasons, but 3 main categories may make the most sense. The first, those who are seeking to be received. So they are seeking reception. Most likely, these are people who were raised more or less, in some sense, formed in a Christian tradition, maybe your own Christian tradition or another Christian tradition, and are now wanting to explore your particular community. And if outside your tradition, your particular tradition. Often especially in American Protestantism, this is the sense of transferring membership. tends to be the language used in some places. The second one are those who really are wishing to return in some sense. They're returning to participation. They're already a part of your community, but they've lapsed in some sense. They may be the, Christmas, Easter person, or they show up only when their children have something going on, or for weddings and funerals. They were raised in your community or raised and then moved to your community, but they fell away in some sense and for some reason. And now they want to return. The important thing when working with people in this category is to make sure to not be judgmental. People go off and do things for a variety of reasons and feel called to return for a variety of reasons. It's not our job as practitioners to judge their reasons, but rather to welcome them into this process, to welcome them into this ministry. Some people may have gone off to explore other spiritual options. I mean, that's kind of the quintessential going off to college and figuring out what is all out there. There are those who had been hurt directly or indirectly by the church, and therefore did not feel the church to be a place for them because of how they were impacted by that. And it's important to take that seriously. And all of our traditions have had some form of scandal in them that we need to make sure to take serious. Some have had a life circumstance that has brought them to a crisis moment, maybe. And through that crisis moment, have gone searching again, searching for meaning, searching for something that's life-giving. And they return to your context. And some left just because of apathy. Like, I need to take a break. And now after whatever they've taken the break from, they're returning. I would say that, at least in my experience, return was the most common in my community. Some of it was coupled with reception. They're transferring to a church, but they hadn't gone for 10 years. And so they're wanting me to be received into a congregation. But they're also, when you dig deeper and have these conversations, you realize it's really a return to the faith that they had not been actively engaged with for a decade or so. And moving to a new city actually was that crisis moment that brought them back to the church. And then there's third one are those who are seeking renewal. These are in some sense, the average parishioner in your congregation, faithful worshiper, goes to various opportunities for formation that your congregation, your parish may have, but really wants to have a dedicated time and a dedicated structure to dig deeper. They want to go through renewal, and they want to do it over a longer process than just going on a retreat for a weekend. They want to go through a ritual process over a number of months that can bring them from one place where they are in their faith to maybe a different place in their faith. So these are I would say, in some sense, these are your three primary groups of fish. We use the fishing for people imagery from the Gospels. These are the big three nets. Of course, every fish within a net is still unique and different. It may even be a different type of fish. but you still have these three big nets in which your fish appear. Are there any questions on that? Does that seem consistent with your experience of those who have come for affirmation or reaffirmation of baptism?
Can somebody say amen?
Amen. I would say that we did have a few people who have been in the congregation for many, many years and maybe didn't know they wanted to dig deeper in their faith. For instance, we had one gentleman who was a companion to a candidate, and he received a lot of spiritual growth by being part of the catechumenate process. And I know that there are others out there, and I can see them coming forward as they know others are experiencing what those in the catechumenate process are experiencing.
It happened maybe 3 times in the years I was there that we would have someone serve as a sponsor. And then the next time the catechumenate came around, they participated as an affirmer, because they got to hear from the affirmer they were sponsoring what the experience was like, and they wanted to do that too. And actually that in some sense was the best advertising we had within the congregation for people to participate, was kind of to move from being a sponsor to an affirmer. And then in 2 years, they would join the team because they wanted to do it all the time, and they wanted to be with the people to do it all the time. It was a very interesting transformation to see. Yeah, I'd say I think we had 3 people that kind of took those steps through the process and became, and I actually are doing the team now that I'm no longer there. So yeah. It's, I mean, you all know this, and this has been in the literature since me and my Protestants started investigating the catechumenate. Is part of the joy is it is a congregational based process. It's not clergy centric, it's not director of Christian ed centric, but it's really congregation centric because of that. And so those to me were always the prime examples of how this was a congregational ministry and not just a ministry of a couple of people, was because we would have the whole congregation involved and want to participate in that way.
I appreciate your reflections, Kyle, and I would say that's accurate. I guess I've always had 1 or 2, so you're 1 in 5 about baptism feels about right. And I'd also underline what was just shared by a number of people, how sometimes the folks that go through the largest renewal are the sponsors.
Yeah, I think it's powerful. It really gets to that. The power of this accompaniment model, which we all know, it's just, we don't know how strong it is until we actually experience it ourselves or have people tell us about their experience. So to get to your question, Larry, about the kind of how does this relate to our customary 4-fold process of the catechumenate? We have the 4-fold inquiry, and then you have the catechumenate proper, or the affirmers, and then you have the period of intense preparation if you're doing an Easter-based cycle, that's Lent, and then you have your mystagogy at the end. You kind of figure out, what does this all mean for me living in my life as a Christian? And certainly the process of affirmation, reaffirmation follows a very similar process. But if we get a sense that of connecting it with those holistic actions, the period of inquiry tends to be people asking questions. And they tend to be very content-based questions. And for those who've not really had experiences of Jesus, it's an opportunity to tell them about Jesus, to tell them about Jesus. Again, that information aspect. And you connect them. You start getting in the direction of the others. And so, you have your right of you're welcome. You move to the next phase. And you can look at the ecumenical rites on the Journey to Baptismal Living website that goes more into the ritual practices. The exploration, which, in those going to baptism is the catechumenate proper, this provides you the opportunity to explore faith in Christ and its implications in life. So this gets to that formation aspect. Now I know a little. I can recite the creed. Now I'm going to figure out, what does this mean for my life? How am I a different person because of what I profess in that little 12-line blurb of the Christian faith? The third, and so then that's kind of, the commitment to, enrollment, we would say, or an election in the traditional catechumenate structure. That's what the end of the result of that would be. The third, the immediate or intense preparation, starts getting at the beginning of the process of constantly being in renewal. And remember, these people are already baptized. So it's about the renewal of baptism or the affirmation of baptism. So even before they profess their affirmation of baptism, you start beginning to think about, what does life mean? What does it mean for to be reformed as a baptized child of God? And so that you get that in this preparation for the actual rite of affirmation by reflecting on, what does it mean to be baptized? What is affirmation of baptism? And then, of course, the fourth, which is traditionally mystagogy, becomes the opportunity to find reflection, to claim the process and discern the future. And this leads to the transformation. I've gone through all this. I've in some sense, I've gained more information. I've been formed in a particular way, maybe in a way slightly different than I had been before. I continue that practice of formation through this reformation. And now I start the process of transformation and living in a new way, in that metanoia way, in that way that's been turned around, or for some, turned upside down, because things are so different from where they've been before. Well, you're saying to yourself, that is all well and good. I'm all ready to get started. But how do I figure out where all these people are? How do I know where they should fall in the process, and how best as a team or as practitioners can we be in helping them get what they need to get to transformation? Well, that requires the initial conversation. You actually have to talk with them. You may say, well, that seems simple enough. Well, it is. Have a conversation. Talk to them. Don't tell them what you think they need. I mean, we're all good at that. The church is very good at that, at saying, here's what we think you need. Number one, Jesus. Well, I mean, that is the answer for everything. But a conversation, which is a two-way street, requires them to really help you to understand and to tell you what they need so that you can find where their needs and what your community has to offer can come together. It makes sense, but sometimes in a very programmatic way. Don't think programmatically, but we often think programmatically. We've been formed in some way to do that. We want to get to the action item right away without doing the preparatory work. And the action item is the catechumenate. The preparatory work is to help figure out what's going to work best. So, because conversations tend to be hard, especially in the 21st century, where sometimes they become hostile, and we've been so accustomed to just saying, well, tell me something. And the person on the other side going, what do you want to know? And then the questioner says, well, tell me what you think I should know. And the person is like, well, what do you think you should know? I mean, that sounds like every conversation I have sometimes. What we've provided, and you will get a full document of this because of your participation, is the Western conversation came up with some leading questions. And it's important, before I put them on the screen, to tell it, these should always be open-ended questions. Nothing should be yes, no. These questions are all designed to be invitations. In fact, the primary questions aren't even questions. They don't have a who, what, when, where, why, how. They are inviting the person to tell their story. And the first part of this, of course, is for them to tell you where they've been and where they are now. With question, to invite the potential inquirer to tell you about their experience of religion or spirituality, their experience of church, including any family connections one may have. And you'll find probably that, so-and-so's mom or dad was a pastor, and that's why they left, because they couldn't stand being the PK anymore. And really to have a broader understanding of church than you showed up for worship on Sunday, or you went to Sunday school or confirmation. But were you involved in some youth groups? Were you involved in the choir? Did you go on any mission experiences, both domestic and international? Or social justice involvement with, when they think about it, was somehow related to a church, but at the time they didn't think of it that way. They thought of it as doing good work in the world. This also provides the person an opportunity to talk about their current relationship with the church. Have the potential inquirer tell you about important people in their life, people who have shaped them and who they are. And that is not a necessarily deep theological question on the surface, but allows you to get to deep theological questions by having a sense of who they are and how they were formed in possibly a non-church context. Could be a church context as well. Have the person tell you about a vivid experience from growing up that influenced who they are and who they are today. And then we have some more churchy specific. What is the role of the Bible in your life? And that one you have to, be prepared, of course, for the answer to say it doesn't have a role. And again, the big part of this is to be non-judgmental. And it's not necessary at this moment to follow up. Well, why wasn't it a big part? No, don't do that. That shuts it down. You have a whole catechumenate process to have to have them gain a healthy relationship with Scripture. In this conversation is not the time to start that. It's a time to hear their story. Who is Jesus to them? Who is Jesus for them? And the role of prayer. Or even, to make it more general, the role of spiritual practices. And have they changed over time? So this helps you understand where the person is coming from. Part of the catechumen, of course, though, because we want to go from information to formation to reformation to transformation, is about movement. So you also want a second set of questions about the future. And this really helps you then as the practitioner to understand that, the alignment or what this potential inquirer might need to have the catechumenate be a life-giving experience and a life-changing experience for them. A big question, and we should all be asking our questions, ask this question of ourselves every day anyway. How does the person feel that God might be calling them today? And into the future, of course, but today. God calls different times for different people for different things. But what is that call today at the right moment? If they've not been an active member, or they're from another tradition, another denomination, tell me about what makes you interested in connecting or reconnecting with this community. A sense of purpose, a sense of meaning, which really connect to the head and the heart? Or are there priorities and patterns in your life that you'd like to change? And Michael had mentioned in one of his examples about the person who had gone through realized they had to change their jobs because there was something that needed, a priority that needed to change. If it's through the conversation you've discerned that the person's been in this seeking journey for a long time, it's the question about why here, why now? Don't say it that directly, but what about this community, or what about your story at the moment is calling you to connect or reconnect with this community? If something had driven them away from the church, where they felt that they had to leave, why? What is their, ask them about their hope or how the community can help them in their current place and their current needs. And it's also important to ask them about about struggling at all with stability and acceptance. And that's delicate, but certainly important. The catechumenate frankly requires a time commitment. And it's about transformation. It's about change. And in order for change to take place, they have to be at a place where acceptance is possible. Acceptance of themselves where they are currently, but also acceptance of the person they may become through going through the catechumenate.
And I can, if I may second that, my sister, who spent 19 years directing an RCIA program, also did work with a group of people in Louisville who were emotionally challenged And it was this particular one that they were looking for a community which would accept them for who they were. They especially liked liturgical churches because there was a pattern there that they could, that was predictable and stable. And this was a great help for them for finding self-acceptance and a sense of being accepted by others.
So that's the basis of the initial conversation. And based on the data, what you find out helps you gauge where they could best enter the process, so that information formation and reformation can happen. Are there any questions on the initial conversation?
I think one thing I've experienced, and it's similar to spiritual direction. Some people, not by any fault of their own, have a hard time articulating some of these inner questions, even though they're open-ended. It takes them a while sometimes to articulate that. So I guess my question is, that's been part of my experience. What are some ways of helping people with that? Because we're talking about things that most people do not talk about with other people.
And I mean, that's very true. And I think in some sense, this isn't the clinical intake form when going into the hospital to know about, did you get your rabies shot and all that stuff. And so it shouldn't have that sense to it. The initial conversation could be over a period of time and multiple conversations, even though it's technically the initial one. Part of it, because these are what I often talk to my students about, is these are heart questions. And heart questions are the hardest questions. There requires a level of trust and vulnerability in order to get to those heart questions. And so if we think about the old models of the catechumenate, what was the inquiry stage or the pre-catechumenate, all know that in the literature that's always referred to as the open-ended period, that we tend to shove into 5 weeks because we need to move on to the next stage. But really to take that open-endedness seriously, where you may have to be engaging in just a relationship for a number of months to get to a place where these conversations aren't painful or awkward. And so to really, like I said, take seriously that open-endedness. And it may be that, because if they're painful and awkward at the outset, it's going to be painful and awkward in a bad way when they're in the process itself. And you could have more damage done because they were not ready at all. So remember, part of the initial conversation is to kind of gauge the readiness to figure out what's going to work best. Well, one of the things is, if you can't yet have that conversation, that also helps you understand the readiness. It means more time has to go into it. They may have to wait a cycle if you do your catechumenate on cycles. But again, because part of this is to discern what is going to be the most life-giving experience of faith formation that's possible. So yeah, it takes time, and that's in some sense why the catechumenate is countercultural today is because not only is it take time where it's itself a couple of months or 6 months or 9 months as a process, but it takes time to even get into the process. But that transformation on the other end is also countercultural. So the output is also this life-giving thing. And so you want the whole thing to be that way. But yeah, I mean, don't force it. I mean, that's kind of the crass answer. Don't force this. You know, you don't want them, you don't want to be the, you don't want them to leave the church again. Don't scare them away again. Other
And
questions?
I always like to point out that St. Augustine was a catechumen for years and years and was kind of faithful about it.
Mm-hmm. What did we go to 9:30 or did we go to just 9? So I've done
9. Well, we've been talking for an hour now.
okay.
So if anybody feels like they need to leave, that's perfectly okay. But if there are more questions, comments.
I have a question. This sounds like a long-term conversation between the person in the catechumenate on team and a person who's inquiring who wants to possibly wants to come into the process. So is that the way it's done, one-on-one? So you would meet week after week with one-on-one?
It would certainly be one-on-one. Again, because you're in some sense, the conversation that you're having has to presuppose a little bit of a relationship because of the types of questions or the types of conversation you're having. I mean, if the person's in a particular mindset or a particular place in their own faith journey, this could happen 1 week, and then maybe your catechumenate starts the next week. It all depends on your structure, but it may take a couple of times gathering. I think kind of to what Larry was saying, because these can be difficult. Part of it is you have to kind of feel out how it's going. Maybe you only ask 1 or 2 questions or have 1 or 2 discussion points during one-on-one session. And that's a lot for someone. And so you gather another time one-on-one and you have more of the conversation. So yeah, I think it may take a couple of weeks. It may take a longer period of time. Again, open-ended.
Kyle, I like when you were talking about renewal earlier, you talk about people needing a dedicated structure to dig deeper. I think in many ways, that's a very good definition of catechumenate. In terms of its being different from a Bible study or a adult ed or something like that. It's a place where people know they can week by week dig deeper. And for us, that means that the leaders need to be doing the same thing. We need to be, in a sense, all in it together, I think, to get the honesty and the trust to dig. So I really like that way of distinguishing catechumenate from other adult study kinds of things, and the realization that we're all doing it in some sense together.
Mm-hmm. I mean, what's always, so in my own kind of journey of working with this, I was introduced to the catechumenate in an elective I took in seminary, creating catechumenal congregations. And then just kind of had it, in the back of my head for a while. And then when I was doing my PhD, I got really invested in figuring out how do you teach, and doing theological pedagogy, alongside studying liturgy and stuff. and came across all these approaches to pedagogy and andragogy, the teaching of adults, and really fell in love with social constructivism, where as a community, you construct knowledge based on your experience and your relationships with one another, and you have a teacher there who helps facilitate this. And then I thought, where have I heard that before? And I realized that's the catechumenate model. And it was like, wow, gee, they figured that out already in the 4th century. And so it's not Vygotsky or Piaget who came up with this. It's Ambrose and Augustine and Theodore of Mopsuestia. And then the second one was, and this hit home for me last year. In education, we have to talk about phases of engagement. And you structure a class where you have people engage in different ways throughout because it builds on one another. And so in our Western conversation, when we started talking about information, formation, reformation, transformation, to me, that's parallel with phases of engagement. So yeah, it's in some sense, cognitive science from the pedagogical side really backs up this approach as being more than just sticking it in one year and it falling out the other, which, behaviorism can lead itself to, but really, these more cognitively based formative approaches to education is really at the heart of that. And also at the heart of not separating the head from the heart, but it's that holistic approach. So yeah, those were my aha moments. And another one, of course, being the need for structure. People need structure.
So let me ask you one other question then. It would seem like when you're beginning a program, and if you're including new people I'm talking about the team, if you're including new people in the program, you really should go through this process with the whole team, because otherwise you may have people asking questions and they don't themselves have a sufficient answer. So you want to be sure everybody on the team is so it's sort of a prequel to doing anything in catechumenate would be to be sure that the people who are on the team can answer all these questions, can have a serious conversation on all of this before we start talking to inquirers about it.
Yeah, I think, practice, in some sense, practice makes perfect, or practice makes adequate, depending on your philosophy. But you're right, people shouldn't go into this cold. I would also, that's just in doing the catechumenate in general, people shouldn't go into that cold. Because our default thinking is always going to be, I'm teaching a class for an hour a week. And so to give them opportunities for themselves to experience formation, to model it, you may, I'm thinking back to the old CPE approach where you had the verbatims, where you did your pastoral conversations with people in the healthcare setting, and then you had to replay it for the group, and you kind of figured out what was happening and what the dynamics were. I mean, I still use that model in the few times I've taught pastoral care, I've used that model still because it works. But yeah, you might want to have people ask each other those questions in the team. I think it would actually help this team itself, because like I said earlier, the questions require a level of vulnerability and trust. And a good team needs to also have a level of vulnerability and trust, because of the work the team is doing is important work. And you want that cohesion, because if the team can be cohesive, the group that you've gathered for the catechumenate can also more likely be cohesive, because you're modeling it. So yeah, I think you're exactly right. That makes sense. Yeah. Gene.
The initial conversation is a great model for team formation.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to let Fred know that at Trinity, we just enlarged our team this year with diversification and the number of people, because we're going to do our catechumenate process year round. And so you have to have a good sized team to be able to do that. So what we did is the new people coming into the team, we went through this exact process ourselves amongst each other. So we'll all be trained the same way that we were with each other, as so that we can answer these questions for the inquirers. Does that make sense? So the team knows everything in and out about each other, so that we can help those that become part of the process.
Well, I think that does it, Michael, if you wanted to kind of wrap us up.
Yes. First, many thanks to Kyle and his busy teaching schedule for taking the time to do this for us. And most immediately, we'll be sending you, we already sent you, like after you've had this conversation, we put together, okay, sit down, grid this person. What does this person need? Does this person need more information, formation, of what sort and what direction? And that's why we produced the one pager, which we thought would be a great way to sort of pull this person together through the discernment of the team. You've already had a look at that. We'll be sending you a lot of what Kyle has talked about in a written form. And also, there will be a survey monkey coming, because we want to know what your experience of this was. And suggestions are most appreciated. We're still learning. Also, so much of coming to believe in Jesus comes through the worshiping community. If we really believe that the worshiping community is the body of Christ, then it's by encountering all of these people individually and collectively is when they begin to see the diversity of Jesus and yet the unity of Jesus. And that's why the rites are so important, because the rites are not so much the head as they are the heart. It's kind of interesting. You can be dating somebody, you can be engaged, but it isn't until you stand up there before God and the community and say, I do, that all of a sudden your heart moves in a different way. And that's true of these. The thing is, as Kyle said, most of the people who come to us are not unbaptized. They are the already baptized. And the classic rites for the catechumenate do not exactly fit with someone who is already baptized, because of if we and all of our denominations do take this seriously, baptism is God's initiative, God's covenant, and that love and that covenant are irrevocable. So how do we ritualize in the midst of the worshiping community their attempt to walk on a journey exploring how do I get to the affirmation of my baptism? So the Eastern conversation's been working with that. And I think our current title, like if you were unbaptized, we'd call you welcoming a hearer, welcoming a catechumen. But if you're already baptized, It's welcoming an already baptized person to a journey of affirmation. And so our next community chat is going to be about that other aspect of the catechumenal process. Even with the already baptized, you can do rites that will end one phase, so to speak, and embark upon another, that they will experience as a transitional moment, not just in themselves, but also in their connection to the overall community. And I can speak from experience. It's when the people out in the pews see them up there, when they go to coffee hour, they'll walk up and say hi. That's where the knitting of relationship takes place. Having seen them up in front, having heard them talk about themselves, having seen the sponsors support them, having held up your hand in blessing over them, the connection with the community comes so strongly through those rites. And if we really believe the community is the body of Christ, that is part of the transformational process.